Right, this is AQA Psychology, and this is aggression, and this is the last part of media influences. We're going to look at desensitisation, disinhibition, and cognitive priming. Now, the first one to look at is desensitisation. The idea behind this is that when we watch something that's violent, if we watch a violent film or play a violent computer game, what happens is physiological arousal. So our heart beats faster, we start sweating. It's quite an unpleasant reaction. And the idea is that the more violence that we watch, basically, we become less sensitive to it, so you get less of this strong emotional reaction. So if we look at this diagram here, it says repeated viewing of media violence leads to a reduction in the emotional response to media violence and increased acceptance of real violence. So when we view violence either in reality or in the media, we have less of an emotional response, we're less sensitive to it, we have less of that physiological arousal. And then what happens is increasingly violent media is needed to produce an effect to satisfy that need for emotional arousal. So we become less sensitive over time. Then a game that we're playing, if it's just the same level of violence, doesn't get us excited in the same way. We don't have that reaction to it, and then we have to move on to watching or playing something that's more violent in order to get that same effect out of it. So it's the idea that we get basically less sensitive to violence over time as a result of viewing it. So just looking at that particular one, let's look at AO3. Is this really an effect that happens? What's the evidence? The first piece of evidence is by someone called Bushman, and he got participants to play violent video games and found that those who had played violent video games rather than non-violent video games, they took longer to help somebody who'd been injured than the other participants. So basically their emotional responsiveness was reduced. So that's linking back to this whole idea of it's a reduction in emotional response that you can see here in this diagram. Okay, so that supports the whole idea. If you've played a violent video game, you're less likely to help someone, you're less emotionally responsive. And then Carnegie found that there was a short-term desensitisation effect where those who played a violent video game showed less emotional arousal when watching a film of real-life violence. So he actually hooked his participants up to various scanners. He took their heart rate. GSR is where you measure the conductivity of the skin, so it should show if you're starting to sweat or anything like that. So that was quite a good study in terms of being quite scientific. So he showed that there was an effect because they played a violent video game and then they had less arousal, less physiological and emotional arousal when they saw real life violence on a film. Obviously not actually real life violence, but real life violence on a film rather than in a video game. A key problem here is that it's really hard to establish cause and effect, to say that that desensitisation causes aggression. So some people might be more vulnerable to it than others. Everyone sees violence in some form, but people are affected in different ways. So some people just don't really get desensitised to it while others do. So it's really hard to say desensitisation is what happens and this causes aggression, because even in these studies that you can see here, there's loads of other factors involved, different participants who watch violent media and so on. It may affect them in a different way. So it's really hard to actually establish that desensitisation is what's causing the aggression. And a lot of the research as well looks at the short-term effects rather than the long-term effects. If you look at both of those studies at the top there, both of those look at short-term effects. And actually what we're probably more interested in is the longer term effects of does desensitisation cause aggression in the long run, because aggression really is a behaviour that occurs in the longer term. Okay, So you've got 2 supporting studies and then 2 problems there. Right, disinhibition, next one. The idea behind this is that normally aggressive behaviour is inhibited. We control our aggressive behaviour, we inhibit it. Because of social constraints and so on, it's not an acceptable behaviour to show. So, but what happens when we watch violent media, that basically weakens those social constraints. The idea is if we watch violence on TV, then why and it's kind of acceptable in that situation, it makes it more acceptable to us in real life. It kind of weakens those social constraints that stop us from being verbally or physically aggressive in real life. So the behaviours then, they're not inhibited, we don't control them or prevent them, because those social constraints that help to inhibit and control them have been weakened by what we've seen in the media. So that's the idea about disinhibition. And again, does it really happen? Berkowitz found that participants who saw a film showing aggression as vengeance were more aggressive afterwards. So that supports the whole idea that media violence can disinhibit aggressive behaviour if it's seen as justified. So he's used the whole vengeance thing there. It's about giving it a justifiable reason for the aggression, which is more likely to weaken the social constraints in real life. If we look back at the idea of disinhibition, where social constraints are being weakened, where if violence is acceptable in a situation, why not in real life? If you link that back to Berkowitz here, he's showing a situation in a film where aggression is acceptable and justified, and then that's leading to aggression, so that supports it. And then the second one here, Josephson, violent TV causes aggression in his study, but only in boys rated as aggressive by their teachers, not in boys who are not rated as aggressive. So that suggests really that it's not a straightforward link, that perhaps it happens for some individuals and not other individuals. Perhaps it happens just with computer games but not with TV. So we need to question what's really, again, it's struggling to find any kind of cause and effect here, in the same problem as you have for desensitization, saying that disinhibition causes aggression. It's not that straightforward. Like it might be affected by the kind of media, or it might be affected by individual differences. Okay, last one, cognitive priming. So this is where violent media gives us scripts of situations that we've encountered. Like in computer games, if there's a situation that was encountered where violence was an acceptable way to resolve it, or where it was rewarded, if we then encounter a similar situation in real life, we can basically, if there's an environmental stimulus from the script, it can act as a cue which triggers that same aggressive behaviour. So the idea behind why it's called cognitive priming is the idea that it's priming us. Priming is another word for prepared, where it's kind of preparing us or priming us to be violent, where we act out aggressive behaviour that we've encountered in the media. So it's giving us basically having aggression and violence ready to be used behind the scenes. Okay, so does this really happen? Anderson and Dill found that participants who played violent computer games had more cognitively accessible aggressive thoughts. So that means that they're not having to dig deep to think of things. They've got immediately accessible aggressive thoughts that they can talk about. And then Atkin actually argued that it depends on how realistic the game or film is as to whether cognitive priming occurs. So again, it was investigated, and if there was a game or a film that was really obviously fictitious, it was a less of an effect. But if it was one that was much more based in reality, then it was much more likely to result in cognitive priming. Mixed research. So it shows there's been lots of research into this, as whether cognitive priming occurs. Some shows an effect, but it's not clear how specific it is. There's lots and lots of correlational studies in this area. So again, you can't establish cause and effect from that. It's showing a link between the two, but it's not necessarily showing that one causes the other. And then our last problem really is that it's too oversimplistic. Cognitive priming might have a more subtle effect, so it might perhaps just affect people who are already aggressive and affect them in that way, whereas it's much less likely that cognitive priming will result in someone who's not aggressive at all suddenly becoming aggressive. It's not as simple as that. It's not a simple process. So actually, cognitive priming is probably more subtle than is being suggested here. There you go, that's the last one.